So this lecture will pick up where we left off with Trisha Brown, and we're turning our attention now to Yvonne Rainer, who was a contemporary of Brown's, worked at the Judson, performed work as part of the Judson Dance Theater, was part of its founding membership, studied with Robert Dunn in his composition classes, as did a number of other choreographers. And Yvonne Rainer's gone on to have a really illustrious career, not only as a choreographer, but as a visual artist, turning at some point to making films. And so I imagine that many of you have heard of, if aren't deeply familiar with Rainer's practice. Did I say Rainer before or Brown? I meant Rainer if I said Brown before. But I think it's useful for us to just rehearse a little bit of some of the kind of highlights of Rainer's career, and then turn really more to looking at what Carrie Lambert-Beatty is talking about in her book Being Watched, Yvonne Rainer in the 1960s. So, as I brought up last time, Rainer and Brown both really raised the question of the problem of performance. They put that kind of center stage in the sorts of works they do, which refuse the conventions of kind of spectacle and the theatrical, and really point towards the complexities of presenting everyday life on stage. They look at the problems of that in terms of the artifice of the theatrical, as I talked about last time. But with Rainer, there's also this particular component of looking at the problem of the spectacle of performance. That in performance, it's always a case that some bodies are staring at other bodies. We see in Rainer's practice a real profound interest in the materiality of the body, what Carrie Lambert-Beatty talks about as the weight of the body socially and politically, and she speaks about it specifically in relationship to Rainer's obsession with the image from the newspaper of during the Vietnam War of the man being shot dead. But Rainer has a sort of profound interest in the body's materiality, in its capacity to kind of live and die. And on top of that, she sort of wants to raise the stakes of how we view the body in public at all. So she in, I believe it's 1965, 66, she puts out something called what becomes to be called the No Manifesto. Which is a manifesto that is predicated on a series of no statements in which Rainer says no to spectacle and no to theatricality, and in many ways refuses the kinds of gaze that are often cast upon the female body, especially the female body in performance. So she's really working against the kinds of conventions of femininity that women are often looked at, and the kind of conventions of the male gaze in particular, through which they are looked at, which condition what the social and political resonances and ways in which we view the female body at all. That's a really complicated way of just saying that there's a sort of inherent misogyny to men looking at women and to men objectifying women, which I feel like perhaps rings true still today. But Rainer is actually trying to reject all this, and trying to reject this through performance itself. So it creates this paradox, right? Where she's saying, I want to perform, and yet I don't want my body to perform in that way for a kind of male public, right? And I think rather than saying that Rainer is for or against one or the other, that it's actually in that paradox of what are the politics of being seen and seeing that is so fundamental and so generative for Rainer's practice, right? It's predicated around some of these questions that she raises. So this all comes up in Carrie Lambert-Beatty's text, which is really a text about visuality and about the politics of being seen. In the very beginning, Lambert-Beatty quotes the idea from Rainer that theater is always about one group of people looking at another. And when we think of the long history of this sort of spectacle, we can see the problems with that, not only in relationship to the female body, but also in relationship to race, sexuality, and other forms of gender as well, where we see the kind of spectacle that often surrounds these presumably exceptional bodies. And, I put that in quotes because, of course, there's nothing exceptional, but that there is such a spectacle around sexuality and such a spectacle around race in some ways, that presenting any sort of body marked by difference would be problematic in the context of performance. So Carrie Lambert-Beatty specifically talks in the chapter I gave you about one performance that Rayner does called Trio A. And Trio A is part of a larger series called Mind as a Muscle. The Trio A gets kind of sectioned out as its own work, and it's the thing that Rayner is most famous for. It's the video that you'll watch even though the choreography was made in the 60s, the video was made in 1978 by this dance historian, Sally Baines. And Lambert-Beatty positions Trio A not only as a historical shift in dance, but in the arts more broadly, where what you'll see in the performance is a sort of attempt to keep the movement on a continuous level of energy and a refusal to look at the audience directly at any given point. So there's a sort of internal quality to the movement, that it resides just with the dancer. It's not looking for the audience's recognition, and that it exists in this kind of monotone level where no movement is given hierarchy over another movement. One thing seems to just follow another, like very consistently. And Lambert-Beatty positions this as a kind of as a shift in dance, but in the arts more broadly, by looking at the work in its larger historical context and the way it not only plays with a question of feminist art and Rayner's No manifesto, but also with the conventions of media and technology and their capture of the body. So she looks a lot at television, a lot at movies, and we can see even in that photograph that Rayner is obsessed with, the ways in which bodies are constantly being reproduced through technological means. So she says on 131, quote, "For Trio A's meaning and historical significance comes not solely from its relation to previous dance, but also from its entwinement with the visual art of its time, particularly minimalism and the technologies of representation by which it was surrounded." And here she's really talking about the rise in television and film, but also the ways in which dance, by intervening, Rayner's dance in particular, by intervening in the field of visuality, by questions of what can be seen and what can't be seen in a performance, is in some ways in collusion with other interventions happening in the visual arts where the visual is more obviously on display. Lambert-Beatty points our attention to dance's mediation by images in this way. She talks, as I talked about last time, of how dance is a kind of ephemeral practice. It's temporal. It exists in time. It comes and goes. And when you're no longer in the presence of dance, the way it remains is precisely through documents such as photographs and video. And it opens up questions for us then, of course, about how stillness functions in relationship to this, right? If dance is often thought about as comprised of movement, the kind of evidence of dance, the photographs, tend to focus on stillness, right? The thing, and it raises this question that we can borrow from kind of Rayner and from Lambert-Beatty of how dance is comprised in the audience's mind through a focus of attention on particular moments, and that perhaps the things we are most attentive to are actually the stiller moments, the moments that kind of catalog themselves as images, as powerful images, more so than anything else. So there's a question for Rayner from the very beginning of, can we even get to movement at all? Can we even access movement at all, right? In some ways, Lambert-Beatty argues that Trio A sort of refuses this picturesque stillness, this tendency of dance to be kind of categorized by its climactic moments. That Trio A refuses this by creating a continuum in which actions don't have an arc, but one thing follows another. So as I mentioned, that kind of monotone layer of action. So when you watch the video, you'll see a kind of steady through line, almost like that constant hum or tone that carries throughout the work. But even this adds complexity for Carrie Lambert-Beatty and isn't just about refusing spectacle, but rather in the nature of that kind of atonal or some kind of continuum of action, we can ask, does one thing follow another, or is it all the same thing? How do we know that one thing after another is happening in this if there aren't ways in which the work is punctuated? If instead the attempt is to try and keep it all at one level, isn't it all just one long movement, right? And this question isn't something that we can resolve or that I have an answer to for you, but it brings up part of the kind of the interest I have in Rayner's work and the complexity she brings up about seeing things at all. That in kind of presenting a dance that is almost as consistent as a visual artwork, we have to wonder if it's made of several components or if it's one component altogether, right? Lambert-Beatty goes from this position to think about the mediatized body and how television, for instance, can become a tool that actually distances us from the rather obstinate physicality of the body. So it's not just that bodies are constantly reproduced by the media, but in what ways are these representations in film and video and television actually kind of alienating us, distancing us from actually understanding, appreciating, or confronting even the physical body. You can see this as well in the article that I gave you by So-Young Yoon, where she discusses a much more recent piece of Yvonne Rayner's in which she's dealing explicitly with the aging body in dance. And Rayner's in her 80s and continues to dance, and I think part of that is not only part of her total badassness, but also part of her own interest in exploring the body's physical capacities at various stages. That the body has some sort of material quality to it, that there's no perfection in this dance, and that as much as her body can't do things, that is also constitutive of what the body is, right? In the context of Lambert-Beatty's work, the live body cannot be said to be only trouble, cannot be said to only trouble spectatorship, or ways of looking at it, but in some ways to return us to a sense of the body divorced by the interventions of media and mediums, including video and photography. So that is to say that even if Rayner is kind of raising the problem of the live body in performance, she's also deeply fascinated in her work with liveness as a way of ameliorating or kind of working against the way that media tends to kind of flatten out our relationship to other bodies. This points Carrie Lambert-Beatty to the fact that even if a dance like Trio A relies on a certain radical continuity or a non-fluctuation or no punctuation in the movement, that it does so through the perpetual maintenance of the dancer who internally is attempting to maintain this flatness. So that's to say, if you were to try and reperform Trio A, and I've tried this and I highly recommend you try it actually, it's incredibly difficult to maintain that level of consistency that you see in Yvonne Rayner. It's incredibly difficult because the movements, as we tend to want to punctuate movement. We need to maintain our balance and our stillness. And so as she moves through the series of movements, to keep it all on one plane requires an inordinate amount of effort, amount of musculature, an amount of balance, an amount of kind of mental preparedness as well. And we don't see any of that. Right? You don't see that unless you experience the body. So even in confronting Trio A, as much as we're watching the body perform, we actually are not watching the body go through the motions, right? We're not watching it struggle to perform. We're actually just being presented with this continuity that internally is much more difficult to sustain. So the flatness isn't the baseline of the performance. It's not that the performance is about a kind of flatness, but it's actually part of the performance's sort of false appearance or refusal to appear in some ways. So it's this really trippy thing where we're looking at a body performing and we're seeing the body in front of us, and Rayner doesn't do anything explicitly to make it hard for us to see, but she simply brings up these opportunities for us to consider what is it that we can see and what can't we see when we're confronted with dance. And not only that, by turning her dance into media, there's this other layer of what do we see and what don't we see when we look at bodies in media. What is the difference between a live body and the mediatized body or the body in film, right? These are all sorts of just very preliminary kind of queries that we could raise about Yvonne Rayner's work. There's so much inside of her practice that could be extended in many directions, which I hope you will do in your papers. And we will pick up in the following weeks with a little bit more contemporary work.